Hello, I'm Heather Williams. I'm a professor of history at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. And I want to thank Rhonda Sharp and Sandy Darity for inviting me to participate in this conference today. I'm really sorry that I'm not able to be there in person, but I think that through this video you'll get a sense of some of the research that I've done and the artwork that I've produced, all on the subject of African Americans and African American history. I want to start with this quilt, which I just simply call my History Quilt. And I actually made it while I was in graduate school. I went to Yale and I was doing a Ph.D. in American Studies and decided that I wanted to study African American history and the history of people who lived in America in the 18th and 19th centuries, which means mostly people who were enslaved. And as I started doing my research, some of the images and the texts that I was finding in the research started to seep into my quilting. I had been quilting for about 10 years before then and had made just quilts with sort of patchwork images. But then I started to incorporate text into the textiles. And so in this quilt, I start out, it's kind of a narrative of slavery moving into freedom. And I start out with this image of the slave ship. It's the Brook that was sketched by English abolitionists in the 18th century who were trying to end the Atlantic slave trade. And if you look very closely, you can see that what might just look like black marks and white marks are really intended to represent the bodies of people and the way that they were packed into these slave ships. And that was one of the big arguments against slavery, was the inhuman ways in which people were treated, in being captured, packed into these ships, taken across in this period that we call the Middle Passage, taken to the Americas, to Brazil, to Jamaica, to South Carolina, for instance. And so I start with that, and that's really the beginning of the history in America, and it's the connection to Africa. And then there are lots of images here, but I'm going to focus on a couple of them. I wanted to tell a story about oppression, but also about resilience and about people who were being forced to labor, because that's what slavery was about. It's an economic system based on exacting labor, unpaid labor from people. So there's a great deal of oppression. I mean, that's an understatement. But then there's also a way in which people manage to create a culture and nourish a culture. And so I wanted to try to capture all of that. So here you see, this is from a newspaper in New Orleans, and it says Negroes at the top, and then it's just ads for people. Sale of Negroes. On the 1st of October next, my house will be open and a large supply of all classes of Negroes offered for sale, imported from Virginia, Maryland, Georgia. So this is part of a domestic slave trade in which people were being sold from the upper South states to places like New Orleans or Charleston or Natchez, Mississippi. So I wanted to give the sense of the commodification of human beings. Here, these are ads. They ran in the newspaper just like this. There would be pages and pages of ads during the height of slavery, of people being offered for sale. This was in the mid-1800s. So you've got that. Then you've got the music for the song Steal Away to Jesus. And over here, sometimes I feel like a motherless child. So again, this sense of culture, of people not writing necessarily, but creating these spirituals, these hymns that they sang as part of the way that they were going to survive the system. You've got people picking cotton, you've got people walking out of a cotton field, and you also have the crafts of enslaved people, so that people who were cabinet makers, people who wove these beautiful baskets. And I wanted to show the multiplicity of this experience. In the quilt, I have a copy of the Emancipation Proclamation, and beside that is an African American soldier. So slavery's coming to an end in the 1860s. and actually ended in 1865. So then there's an ad. So we had ads for people for sale. There's also an ad here for a reward being offered for a runaway slave, a boy named Jacob, who his owner says he's about 14 years old, and he's left. He describes his clothing, and he says he's got 2 guns with him, probably the property of the owner. So these ads had appeared in newspapers throughout the 18th and 19th centuries. And then after slavery ended, you start to see a new kind of ad. And these were called information wanted. And this one was placed by Thornton Copeland in 1866. And he's looking for his mother, whom he had left. He had been sold away from his mother in Richmond, Virginia, about 21 years earlier. So you start to see these people searching for family members after slavery ended. Then I'm going to move to this quilt, which is just called Rice Workers. And this is an image taken right after slavery ended, but it depicts the way that women and girls had worked during slavery in South Carolina, in Georgia, where rice became the cash crop, the main cash crop. In Virginia, it was tobacco. In other places, it was cotton. South Carolina had cotton as well, indigo, other things. But rice, Carolina gold, became the thing that created the wealth of the colony and then the state. And many of the workers in rice were women. They brought, some of them, the early ones who actually came directly from West Africa, from places like Sierra Leone, brought certain skills that they had developed working in rice, and then use them in America, of course, without pay or without getting the benefit of their labor. And so I wanted to just, I love this picture because of the hands, of the arms of these women. Many of them have their arms crossed, some of them have their hands akimbo, and you can see through their stance that they probably did not like this idea of being photographed. This is a time period in the late 1860s, early 1870s, when lots of white men were going south from places like New York, Pennsylvania. They had heard about slavery. They wanted to know what the people were like who had been enslaved. And so journalists were going, photographers were going. And so somebody comes up as these women and girls, and there are a couple of boys as well, are going back on a rice barge after a day of work. And they probably did not think they could say no to their photographs being taken, but I think that their poses, their stance really said something about the way they were feeling about this intrusion. And then here, again, it's about labor, about the kinds of work that people did. That's a major part of what slavery was about. And this is a photograph of a woman named, the only name I know for her is Old Sibby. But I do know that she was a midwife. And I was drawn to this picture by a number of things. Her face, you know, that old face that just looks so familiar to me. Her hands, and I personally was delivered by a midwife who also is my aunt. And so that kind of connection to those hands that delivered how many babies, I don't know. So I'm really drawn to her hands. But also I noticed that she's got on this jacket that has a velvet collar. And so for this quilt, I wanted to use fabric that kind of resonated with that velvet. It's not just cotton that she would normally have worn, or that her dress is made of, or a rough kind of linen. But it's a velvet collar. I don't know where she got it, if she purchased it, or if it was a hand-me-down. But I used this fabric, this kind of sparkling, silky, velvety fabric to complement her outfit. And I'll say that this is the second version of this quilt that I made. The first one that I made, someone purchased for her partner who was finishing nursing school and was becoming a midwife. And as I understand it, it still hangs in that person's office, and so that meant a lot to me. Yeah, so as I said earlier, when I was in grad school, the research that I was doing started to seep into the quilts. And you can really see that that's continued many years now since grad school. But this quilt I made towards the end, probably my last semester in graduate school. And I was doing research on African American education. My dissertation was that, and my first book became a book about African American education in slavery and freedom. And so I saw this photograph, and of course I wanted to work with it. It's a black and white photograph. It was taken right after slavery ended, again in that time period when the South was kind of opening up to outsiders coming in. And I wanted to add some color. And so I used acrylic paint, diluted it with water, and did kind of a color wash so that the girl's dress became this light green, and then the woman's dress is a red color. I also did something a little different in this, because one of the things as a quilter is that you're usually trying to use, at least the books and magazines that I learned to quilt from, really place a lot of emphasis on using small stitches. But for this quilt, I purposely used a large needle, not the small quilting needle that I would usually use, so that my stitches would really show. And the reason I did that was because I imagined that it was this woman who was making the quilt, and that in her dark cabin, and you can see it's a dark space, at least as we're seeing it through the photograph, that she would not have had 500 or 600 watts of light that I have when I'm quilting, and that she would have used a regular size needle. She wouldn't have used a specialized needle for quilting. And so I wanted it to have that effect. I wanted it to sort of fit in with the environment in which she lived. And so this quilt ended up being on the cover of my first book. Again, it's called Self-Taught. And it really, on the cover, starts to capture a sense of what's going on inside the book, because one of the things I write about is the fact that after slavery ended, all these people started going to school, adults and children. And that as soon as you learned, you would go home and start teaching other people. And so I imagine that this girl is helping her mother to read, which is not the way that we would normally experience it, but I think that that may be what's going on in that picture. So this quilt I made just because the picture spoke to me, the photograph spoke to me, and then it ended up being on the cover of the book. This quilt I actually made for the cover of my second book, and that book is called Help Me to Find My People, The African American Search for Family Lost in Slavery. And it really grew out of those information wanted ads. So when I was in grad school, I started coming across them, the ad that Thornton Copeland placed, and I found about 1,200 ads like that. And I've shaped a book around those ads to talk about the forced separation of family during slavery, so that if people, you know, the ad from New Orleans where they're offering people for sale who had been brought down from Maryland. And so if you lived in Maryland or in Virginia, it was quite possible that you might be sold to places like Georgia or South Carolina or Mississippi, Texas, Alabama, Louisiana. And so that this quilt is on the cover, and for me it reflects loss. You've got a child's dress, a little girl's dress, but there's no little girl. So there's absence, there's loss. And I've traced over the handwriting of a woman named Violet Lester, who wrote a letter in 1858 to her former mistress. And she pays her respects to the white family. She talks about the fact that since they sold her, she had been sold probably 5 different times. And then she got to the section that I think is really at the heart of the letter. And so I've traced a little bit here, and it says, I wish to know what has ever become of my precious little girl. I left her in Goldsboro with Mr. Walker, and I have not heard from her since. And she goes on to say that her current owner has said that he might be willing to purchase this child if the child's owners would be willing to part with her. And so I wanted Violet Lester, one of these African American women enslaved people, to start speaking on the outside of the book, as they do very much inside the book. And so that's the cover of that quilt and that book. And then the book, Help Me to Find My People, does not have any photographs inside except for one that depicts a sack, a bag that somebody made in the 1920s. But I end the book with this image of Charlie Crump and his granddaughter. Charlie Crump was a slave in North Carolina. He lived in Raleigh in the 1940s when he was interviewed. And I put this picture at the end of the book to speak to this idea of resilience, so that despite the oppression of slavery, despite the separations of families, despite the whippings, despite the overwork, that most people managed to survive and to build new families and to continue to love people. And we see through Thornton Copeland that even sometimes as many as 20 years, I've seen more than 20 years, 25 years, 30 years, people still remembered the ones they had lost. So they may have moved on, they had created new families, but they had continued to care. And I can never say anything about all African Americans in any time period, but that my research shows that many people did have that experience of being separated and then continuing to care about the ones they had lost, but surviving slavery and or surviving in slavery, because of course not all of them made it to 1865. Slavery lasted for 250 years. But he represents for me that idea of resilience, that here he is, an old man, and he has his granddaughter with him. And so the family continues in that sense. Most of my research and writing and teaching is about the 19th century and sometimes 18th century, so the 1700s and 1800s. But every once in a while I come out into the 20th century, and I imagine I will even go into the 21st century. And in the quilts, that's the case as well. This is an image of a man named Mr. Williams. He was a sharecropper in Alabama. He was a singer, and I just love this photograph. First of all, sort of like old Sibby. He looks familiar to me. I know I don't know him, but he looks like somebody I could know. And he's dapper. You know, he's got on this really nice suit and hat and tie, and I like his hands. I like the way his hands are touching his hat. And so I wanted to work with the photograph. And I framed it with this red to pick up his tie, the color of his tie. But then I went to the Salvation Army, and this is when I was in New Haven, and purchased a pair of men's pants and tie. I bought several ties. And so this is from the pants. And then these are ties. And what I did was to just open up the ties. And I had not realized how much stuffing there is inside a tie. There's a lot of cotton fabric in there, or cotton just stuffing. And so I pulled all that apart, but I left the tie intact in terms of the shape of it. And so you've got the wide part here, and then the thinner part here, and I did it like that, and so it ends up not being a square at all or a rectangle. It's actually a rhombus, I think. And but I think that his tie stands out to me in the photograph, and I wanted to pick that up. And I often work with images of women. He's one of the few men I've ever worked with, and so I thought having men's clothing was appropriate for this. And then this is a quilt that's based on a collage by the African-American artist Romare Bearden, who was out of Charlotte, Mecklenburg County in North Carolina. And I'm really drawn to his collages because, of course, they remind me of quilts. I like some of his other work as well, but the collages really move me. And so I walked around with an image of this collage for years and years and years. And then when I was in Northampton, Massachusetts, one blizzardy winter, I decided to give myself the challenge of making a quilt based on the collage. And so this quilt has all kinds of fabric. It's got wool, and then kind of this sateen, and her hat is made of silk, her body and her clothing are cotton. The flowers are silk and cotton. There's some velvet here for the grass. And it's got layers and layers and layers of fabric, so that if you look, if this flower, for instance, has this layer, the whatever you call that in there, and then this layer. So this is sewn onto this, which is sewn onto the velvet, which is sewn onto a piece of white fabric that's underneath all of it. So there were times like this one, it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 layers. Times when I was stitching through 5 layers of fabric, and I really love this quilt. But one of the things that I'm proudest of is that at Smith, the 2 January terms I was there, I took classes. They have a January term that people don't get credit for. I was a postdoc, so I wasn't getting credit anyway. But one year I took fabric dyeing, and I loved it. I got to play in water for a week. And then the second year I did basket weaving. And so after I learned basket weaving techniques, I decided to weave the basket that Bearden depicts in his collage. And so this is fabric that I cut into strips and then wove. And it's much easier than doing a real basket that's more dimensional. But I love that transferred into fabric. Her fingernails, you'll see she's got nail polish. And so through the quilts, I get to really play. And I think that Mr. Williams, and I call this Romere's Garden. He called his collage, now I've forgotten it, Maudel Sleet's Garden. So Maudel Sleet, he said, was a woman he knew in his neighborhood. But I call it Romere's Garden. And these two, to me, really speak to the beauty that can be found in people's lives, no matter how hard life might be. And that doesn't come out for me as much in the quilts that depict slavery. But in this period after slavery, I think that maybe I'm more able to focus on beauty and just flowers. People have gardens. But of course we know that even after slavery ended, freedom was not always what people had imagined it would be, what African Americans had imagined it would be. And so at the end of slavery, you've got the birth of terrorist organizations like the Ku Klux Klan, you've got Jim Crow laws, you've got laws that try to regain the status quo. So people aren't going to be slaves anymore, but we're going to keep them in the place that we think they should occupy. But I think that in spite of that, there's always some beauty in people's lives and in their world. And I think this quilt really captures some of that. Finally, this is one of the more recent quilts. So this is a quilt that I've made in the 21st century. And I made it after I had finished Help Me to Find My People. So it was after the second book. I was in a store, a fabric store in Soho in New York, and I saw this fabric, and it's this very loosely woven linen fabric, but the color of it, or almost the absence of color, reminded me of the fabric that many enslaved people's clothes were made of. So plantation owners would import Osnaburg cotton from Germany, so cotton fabric from Germany, or right there on the plantation, enslaved women would weave cloth. And it was much coarser than this, but the color of it, the plainness of it reminded me of the clothing. And of course, many of the women on those plantations would then dye the fabric. They would cut the bark of trees and find other ways of producing color so that they didn't all walk around in these bland colors. But this struck me and it reminded me. And I wanted to do something, this is probably one of the simplest quilts that I've ever made. It's not the beauty, it's not the colorful quilt that Romere's Garden is, but I embroidered these words "in honor" on it. And for me, that was a way of thanking the people whose stories I've been able to tell. and of acknowledging the people whose stories are lost to us, because most people did not leave any material for us, or their stories may only be held within their descendants' homes, in their memories, in their families, stories that have been passed on. But for the people who've helped me to do the research that I find so fulfilling, but also, I mean, you know, frankly, honestly, that research advances my career. And so I wanted to just stop for a moment and just say thanks and honor them through this work. And so that's what this quilt is about. It's just very simple. And this will hang in my office as a reminder that when I do the research that I do, it's always about me. I wouldn't do it if it didn't make me feel satisfied. But it's about finding these people's histories and telling those histories. So I want to be able to tell their stories. And in the books, I have them speak as much as possible. I name them when I know their names. So I may only know that somebody's name is Old Sibby. But that's the only name I have for her, and I'm going to use it because so many of them were unnamed in historical records. And for a long time, I think, people, including some historians, thought there were people unworthy of a history that should be told. And so I want to say thanks to them for the stories that they provide that I can then pass down to other people. And I want to thank you all for listening and watching.